1983, the first USFL title game in Denver, Colorado. Michigan Panthers, Philadelphia Stars. Quarterback Bobby Hebert to Anthony Carter. A 48-yard touchdown play that made the difference as Michigan beat Philadelphia 24-22. Hebert, the MVP. And Michigan coach Jim Stanley got the happy ride. 1984 at Tampa. Matched the Stars and the Arizona Wranglers. The Stars dominant, winning 23-3. Stars quarterback Chuck Fusina, first 10 passes completed, named the MVP. And Kelvin Bryant pounded out 115 yards and led the celebration in the clubhouse. '85, Kelvin Bryant and the Stars are back for a third title try. In the semifinal, Bryant, 2 big plays. This 76-yard run, plus a 70-yard pass reception as the Stars won their way over Birmingham and into the title game again. Quarterback Bobby Hebert and Anthony Carter, plus 11 other former Michigan Panthers, now Oakland Invaders. They come to the finale with the best record of the season, a team capable of the spectacular big play. This is a matchup of an explosive offense against a dogged defense. As ABC Sports presents the United States Football League Championship Game, 1985. The Oakland Invaders out of the West and the Baltimore Stars.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Yes, there he is, the unmistakable voice of the recently departed Keith Jackson, the voice for all 3 years or so of the United States Football League. Our topic today here on Good Seats Still Available, that curious little podcast that is devoted to, of course, what used to be in professional sports. My name is Tim Hanlon. I appreciate you giving us a listen. And today we're back into the realm of football, and we're finally getting our first efforts around a league that many people have been requesting. We have a great entree into it, and that, of course, is the United States Football League, a.k.a. the USFL. I think it's so popular because it's a relatively recent endeavor. It was in the early 1980s and was arguably probably the last top-tier professional league to challenge one of the major 4 or 5 sports here in this country. And the USFL is still fresh enough a memory for most people of a certain age, and yet still far enough back that it's a curiosity and a head scratcher. And I think probably only exacerbated by the presence of our current United States president, Mr. Donald Trump. Regardless of what you think about his politics today and the way the government is running or not running, depending on the day you're listening, the unmistakable mark that a young, earlier brash, Donald Trump had on the USFL is quite well known and certainly highly debated and hotly contested in conversation. We're going to get to some of that discussion, some of that history with our guest, Paul Reeths, who is the author of a book courtesy of our friends at McFarland called The United States Football League 1982 to 1986. Don't be misled. The league did not last 4 to 5 years like the title implies. It did in terms of its startup and its ending, but it really on the field was only around for 3 years. But what a 3 years it was. What a crazy story it became. The people, the intrigue, the play, the players, the battle between the NFL and the USFL, the rise of television, and the importance of such in the beginnings of any league, in the case of the USFL, designed with television in mind. And absolutely some amazing and curious personalities, Mr. Trump being one of them, but a whole host of other folks who had various reasons for getting involved in a challenger to the National Football League, albeit not a direct challenger, at least in the beginning, in the spring seasons it was playing. but ultimately being commandeered by, according to many accounts, Donald Trump and his desire to push the league into a direct competitive position with the NFL. And of course, challenging the NFL for its supremacy of professional football in this country via antitrust claims. And we all know how that played out. For those of you who don't know how that played out, you will enjoy this conversation as a primer for our discussions to come, of course, on the old USFL. And today with Paul Reeths, we're going to talk about kind of an entree, I guess, a little poo-poo platter, a little entree into the United States Football League and what it was all about. Coming up in a couple of seconds here on The Big Show. Before we get there, I do want to remind you that, of course, we are sponsored once again by our friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And that is the place, of course, if you want to find memorabilia and programs and media guides and all kinds of things from teams long gone, as well as current teams or iterations of teams that were in various forms prior to their current incarnations. SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. And please, by all means, use the promo code GOODSEATS for your 15% discount on all of your purchases. Again, SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, promo code GOODSEATS for 15% off, again, for all those great things that you're going to find there in the realms of basketball and baseball and football and soccer and tennis and you name it, all kinds of fun and amazing, interesting things for you to discover both visually as well as in your pocketbook. It's SportsHistoryCollectibles.com, promo code GOODSEATS for your 15% discount. We are also sponsored today, of course, by Audible. Audibletrial.com/GoodSeats is the place to go for your free audiobook download and a free 1-month trial of the audiobook service that is Audible. You can cancel at any time. And like I said many times before, there are 180,000 plus and counting titles to choose from. Again, audibletrial.com/GoodSeats for your free audiobook download and a free 1-month trial of the Audible service. Again, you can cancel at any time. We love Audible. We love audiobooks. I believe you will too. Give them a try. Thank you so much, and we appreciate your patronage of such. All right, with that, we move on to our conversation with Paul Reeths, the author of the United States Football League, 1982 to 1986, and our entry conversation into the wild, the wacky, the woolly world of the USFL. At what point do you sort of recognize that the USFL is worthy of its own sort of tome, shall we say? What did you see out there that either was there or not there? And then what was your sort of journey into sort of creating a book and the tale and arguably the definitive tale thus far? There's very few writings thus far, although I do hear some rumors of folks putting some more pen to paper on the league. But how does a book in your mind come together, and what's the process by which you decide to do so?
Well, the league had a book written about it in approximately 1987 by a former communications director. He was there for a time. His name was Jim Byrne, and he wrote a book called The $1 League.
I have for all of our listeners, I am staring at a very old copy of that book. It is out of print. It is called The $1 League, The Rise and Fall of the USFL, written by Jim Byrne, and it is a mini crusade of mine to get it republished in some way, shape, or form.
It is. What kind of motivated me, I guess, is that I didn't feel that it did the league justice, that it was a rushed work. I have since found out that Harry Usher, the league's second commissioner, also planned to do a history of the league. When Byrne found this out, he rushed his book, finished it up before Usher could, and got his published, which essentially cut Usher off. But I think if you look at the book, there are very few sources quoted. It's almost all from Mr. Byrne's perspective. And so I think that it's limited because of that reason. And I felt that the league, because of its importance as the last challenger to a major league, to an established major league, that the USFL needed something better, that it needed something more complete, where those who had made it what it was could participate and could have their voices heard. And so I set out to interview as many people as I could, to get interviews from other sources. A few years ago, ESPN did a a 30 for 30 special on the USFL in which they talked to a lot of people. They could only use a portion of the interviews that they conducted, and they allowed me access to the interviews, and that helped really round out the book as well. So, I wanted this story, my book, to be told in the words of the people who actually lived it, the coaches, the players, the administrators, those who could give, kind of the inside scoop on it and not just be from one perspective.
And the book, and we're going to promote this early and often, of course, is called The United States Football League, 1982 to 1986. Is published by our friends at McFarland and came out last year. Interesting, it's also forwarded by a guy named Steve Earhart. You want to describe who Steve Earhart is and was in relation to the USFL?
Steve Earhart is a guy who was on the USFL's radar before the USFL even began. When they were having just initial discussions, he was involved as a lawyer for various coaches, various players. So he was very familiar with professional football and especially behind the scenes negotiating contracts and things of that nature. Very aware and kind of in the middle of some of the 1982 NFL strike stuff. So he was a guy who was just on the ground and ready, and he was dealing with several coaches who would wind up in the USFL. His name was out there very early, and he became the USFL's first or second employee. After Chet Simmons was hired as commissioner, he hired Steve, and Steve was essentially, he was called the executive director, but essentially like an assistant commissioner. So he did everything behind the scenes for the first year before the league launched, and then the first 2 seasons. After the second season, then he became a part owner of the Memphis Showboats, the GM as well, and moved out there. So he has this wide-ranging perspective on the league that not only lasts from day one, but as many people know, he collected the check, the $3.70-some check from the NFL after the trial concluded. So he was the last remaining person from the executive committee charged with wrapping up the league's business. So he was on for the whole ride and was always somebody who was heavily involved behind the scenes. He couldn't have been more helpful.
Was he your starting point, or did you have other starting points to kind of sort of frame the guts, I guess, of the book and guide you going forward?
I had conducted a few interviews before that, had put together a rough outline of the book, had completed a couple of sample chapters, and called Steve and just let him know what I was working on. And I remember the first call with him, of which we've had many since then. I asked him, I described the book, and he said to me, all right, if we're going to do this, we're going to do this right. Let me see one of your sample chapters. So I sent it over, and I think that convinced him that I was really wanting to catalog the history of the league, that I didn't have any kind of other agenda or anything like that, that I wasn't doing it from a rushed burn perspective, just seeing an opportunity, but that I was really wanting to tell the history of the league because I had enjoyed it so much. And so he was an invaluable asset in putting this book together, in putting me in contact with people that maybe I wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise, and providing behind-the-scenes information in just every facet. Even from a historical perspective, just so much has changed since then. It's hard to put yourself back in the 1980s when you had 3 major television networks and cable penetration was at less than 25% of U.S. households. So what did that look like? How did that affect negotiations? So he was really an invaluable asset.
Well, let's use it as a segue, because into sort of the journey and the history and stuff, and we'll sort of ask some other sort of procedural questions along the way. But I guess maybe take us back, and this is obviously a revisit to your childhood, right, in the early '80s, right? So the idea of this challenger league to the mighty National Football League, right, was pretty much began in the very early part of the 1980s, when indeed you're describing a media landscape that was cable was becoming a thing. It was the era of, calling your cable operator, if you had a cable subscription, to, I want my MTV, right, and other things. ESPN,
right, exactly.
ESPN in 1979, back when it actually stood for something, the Entertainment and Sports Programming Network, college basketball, and, it was really very nascent times. Based on your journey backward into the early rumblings of this league, what is your assessment of, I guess, the narrative of effectively how did this essentially come about from your perspective?
The league was the idea of a man named David Dixon. He was a New Orleans antique dealer. He was pretty well connected down there. Just to say that he was an antique dealer does him a little injustice, because you wonder, how does a guy like that become involved in pro football? But he had been involved in staging NFL exhibition games in New Orleans before the Saints. He had been part of the deal that brokered the Saints and the New Orleans Superdome. So he was a guy who was known in football circles, who could get NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle on the phone. So he was a well-connected guy, and he had had this idea far back, I think before the American Football League merged into the NFL. But it never seemed to be the right time. Tex Schramm of the Cowboys seemed to always have, counter that, it was our idea first. We might do something, as kind of a feeder league, and it never could get traction. Now, when cable burst upon the scene and started to really gain momentum, as you mentioned, 70s, we had some cable, but really in the 80s, it was starting to pick up momentum. Early 80s, you had about 25% of cable penetration. By the close of the decade, I believe they were right up around 50%. So that's when cable was exploding. So Dixon saw this need for programming, not only a need for programming, but people who would pay for it. And he decided that the time was right to launch the USFL. It was actually supposed to launch a year earlier, but they put it off a year in order to get their ownership firmed up. And, it was really cable and the money that you can get from television, because you cannot do pro football without a television contract. You can't pay for all your expenses just out of ticket revenue. There is simply no way. And especially when you're looking at a major league, when you have such resources committed to player salaries. So it was really television that was the driver, and that's no shame. Television's always been the driver. Television's the reason that the American Football League survived when they got their contract with NBC. It's the reason they merged. So there were some attempts, especially at the time, to dismiss the USFL as a television league, which were just, I think they ignored the reality of professional sports at the time, and that the NFL was a television league at that point. It was earning its revenue from television, and it's even more so now. Well, there's no shame in that. It's just the reality.
Yeah, it's absolutely more so now. That, as a matter of fact, you could make the argument that NFL football today is actually propping up the broadcast television industry. I mean, the tail wagging the dog, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the economics of it, and we'll see, with the NFL ratings slide where this all ends up. But yeah, you can't do it without television. And so those who were trying to criticize the USFL at the time as being a television league, it was a ridiculous, nonsensical charge, and it still is.
Well, it's interesting. So the role of David Dixon, he was part of the New Orleans Saints coming to New Orleans. He had this idea rattling around in his head for some time that, I think interestingly, that football could be a spring and summer sport, either in addition or as a continuation to what the NFL and college football did. So that seemed to be an interesting distinction. And if my research is correct, I'm just wondering why it took him until 1980. I mean, obviously he had gone through and seen the World Football League come and go in two sort of very, dysfunctional components. Obviously the AFL was relatively successful in the 60s and what it led to in the early 70s with the merger to the NFL. But I'm just wondering, so in 1980, apparently he commissioned a research firm, ironically very well known in the television industry, called Frank Magid Associates,
right.
Perhaps with a bit of a script, determined that there was an appetite and or a market for spring and summer football. I'm just wondering why 1980, why it took so long at that point, especially given the WFL's spectacular two-part flameout in the mid-'70s. I'm just wondering what was different 5 years hence from there that made him think that now was the time.
And I think you touched on it. I think that part of it is that by 1980, the WFL body was cold in the ground. While that body was warm, while it was still a spectacular failure that everybody knew about, you were going to have a hard time reaching investors. The other part of that is that cable had not yet grown to the point where it could provide revenue. They were tiny, as ESPN launched around 1979. So you didn't have yet the cable penetration. They weren't yet commanding the ad dollars where they could outlay that money then on professional sports. By the early 80s, he saw that trend and he saw that they were ready. And so it was really, if you were going to do it, that was the time. The WFL body was cold in the ground, and the cable television was kind of reaching a little bit of a critical mass.
So, in other words, television was almost thought upon as being the foundational element even before the structure and the stadia and the talent pools and all the sort of particulars of the sport of football itself. It was almost that what he and his colleagues were thinking that, look, let's get this foundational element and our belief in how television is growing in importance cemented almost first and foremost, right?
Yeah, and it absolutely has to be. You have to have ownership. You have to have revenue. And without television, your pro football league is dead. That has been the case for more than 50 years now. And Dixon recognized this opportunity from an additional television resource that hadn't been there before. It had only been the three networks, and the NFL was on all of them. He knew that he would probably run into some resistance, but he correctly thought that by playing at a different time of the year that he could get himself on one of those networks. It was not going to pay what an NFL contract paid, so he had to have some supplement to that. And there was no other alternative until cable began exploding in popularity.
So there is a document, I'm guessing, it was called the Dixon Plan. Number one, I wonder if you happen to know maybe where that document, if it indeed it still exists, might reside. That seems to me almost like a Magna Carta for this league, right?
If anybody had it, besides Dixon himself, who is now passed away, it was John Ralston, who came on and helped Dixon recruit ownership and recruit coaches, and was Dixon's right-hand man during the formative stages of the league. And, unfortunately, we're not able to ask him either. So, yeah, it's probably out there somewhere in somebody's files.
Well, yeah, and that's also sort of another question I was going to ask earlier is I wonder where does most of the sort of, I guess, most important sort of components and pieces of the USFL's history reside, right? Because, until the NFL decides to recognize other components in and around their world over the 75 or 90 years or whatever it is, depending on when you figure out the league actually truly started and feedered into it. Where does this stuff live? Where can this be celebrated, right? You wonder where these components. I remember, a couple of years ago visiting my in-laws down in Jupiter, Florida, where Burt Reynolds mostly lives full-time now. And for a period of time, he had a museum, I guess, devoted to himself, the Burt Reynolds and Friends Museum. And my father-in-law was just incredulous that how transfixed I was with a couple of pieces of that little museum down there, which were an original team-signed ball from the Tampa Bay Bandits and a whole bunch of other sort of, pictures of him and John Bassett on the field and all that kind of stuff. There's so many great sort of stories and pieces out there. I just wonder if there's I don't know if it's a full-fledged Hall of Fame, but you wonder where these things could be. I mean, this was a very rich historical part of pro football in this country.
It is. It is. It's you have, of course, a sitting president who was an owner in the league. You have Hall of Fame players who are in the league. You have players who are all pros and Pro Bowl level players throughout the 80s and 90s who played in the league. So it's not just this little footnote that can be easily dismissed. And as far as the kind of the historical documents of the league, my guess is that Mr. Earhart probably has a lot of them. He has the final check from the NFL. He was involved with the league, so I think he was probably entrusted with keeping those documents. A good number of press releases and meeting notes and memos and things of that have leaked out over the years from various team offices. So some of this exists in collector hands as well.
Well, all right. So let's get into, so the league itself announces its arrival at the famous 21 Club in New York, which, at some point I want to do a live or a recorded podcast from actually that location, because so many interesting leagues and announcements. I mean, the old NASL, when Pele was announced as coming to the New York Cosmos. I mean, there's a lot of the annals of sports history, pro sports history in particular, do wend their way through the tables and the hallways of the 21 Club. But on May 11th, 1982, the announcement to play and begin in 1983 with Chet Simmons, the ESPN president at the time, named as the league's first commissioner. I guess in the lead up to that that presentation, right? How do you think Dixon et al. Get, two television networks? I'm not sure they were conjoined at the time yet.
No.
To actually pay money for something that hasn't even launched yet, given things like the WFL and a whole bunch of leagues in the 1970s, not faring all that well. I mean, that's the ultimate sales job, right? To get somebody in the television world to spend and pay and contractually agree to something that didn't even exist yet.
It was also a gamble. So when they held that press conference on May 11, 1982, they did not announce the television contracts or their commissioner. They announced the formation of a league. They sat at a table with ownership there. Some of that ownership, including Tad Toby, who would end up owning the Oakland team, was not committed. But they took a seat at the table to show that we have a full slate of ownership here. We're ready to go. That was enough. They had discussions with both ABC and ESPN. But ABC was adamant that there will be no contract until there's an announcement, after there's an announcement. They had met some of the ownership. They knew that these guys were well-heeled. It was not a WFL setup where you really had a bunch of people who had no business owning professional football teams. They had no capitalization. There was just simply almost no way for them to avoid financial collapse from the start. The USFL was different. You had guys such as Al Taubman, who was one of the richest guys in America. Not only could he withstand the losses, but he wasn't going to be associated with anything such as the WFL. These are guys of substance who were able to get the attention of Runa Arledge, who was then the president of ABC Sports, and his second in command, Jim Spence. They took these guys seriously because they were serious guys. In the pre-internet age, before you could just look up a guy's bio by typing it into a computer, they didn't need to type in anything. You open up a copy of a business magazine, and these guys were there. So this was serious ownership, and that's what really made the television networks equally serious about the venture. They knew that it was not going to be a WFL situation. They felt also that the Dixon plan, by and large, gave the league a chance to succeed. And ABC had its own plan for the league, and ESPN needed programming. They were trying to kind of work their way out of the tractor pull, late-night Australian rules football league reputation and attract some more major league sports. And the USFL was kind of their start in pro football.
Can you give our audience a sense of some of these original owners in this original pre-first season launch, what some of these folks' background were and maybe how they came together based on your research?
Sure. The kind of the tie that binds so many of these guys together is real estate. These were just really strong real estate guys. A guy like Al Taubman he's one of the guys who really started the shopping mall business. And when you think about that, it just kind of blows your mind because shopping malls are not small. But he was dealing in them as a business. So he was a $400 million net worth kind of guy. Super rich. Miles Tannenbaum in Philadelphia, also a real estate guy. He did the King of Prussia Mall out there. Second year, Eddie DeBartolo Sr., also a mall guy. He came into the picture. So you had principally so many of these real estate guys who were in there. You also had a famous cardiovascular surgeon from Arizona, Dr. Ted Dietrich. He pioneered several of the devices used in heart surgery. So these were guys who were super successful in various fields. Bill Daniels, Alan Harmon, you had a cable television magnate in there. These were not fly-by-the-night operators, and that's when you have a meeting with television executives and you start shaking hands. They knew who these guys were. They knew who Bill Daniels was. They knew who Alan Harmon was to an extent. They knew who Al Taubman was. These guys got their attention. They considered them a serious bunch who were not fools. And so when you start off with that kind of a base, they were willing to listen. The television networks were willing to listen. And then when they examined the Dixon plan, they felt, yeah, this thing does have a shot.
Oh, there's another element there, though, too. And this is certainly one of the themes that I've seen and heard in the last number of months with this sort of silly little podcast and learning about lots of different things along the way, is that to me, one of the common threads of some of this stuff is, let's be frank, ego, right? And almost sort of big boy ego, right? Where, football is, perhaps a childhood memory of their own. And, the chance to have, a very expensive plaything, perhaps, of course, to ensure making money and all that stuff, right, from a business perspective. But it's also, let's be honest, the fortunes that these all gentlemen, right, sort of created or inherited or augmented in their professional careers, right? I'm not sure that they would have necessarily looked upon a startup professional football league as a way to embellish that wealth, right? I mean, there's some practicality that gets kind of thrown out the window when you talk about sort of the dreamlike fantasy, I guess, of owning a professional football team, right?
Yeah, and there is a circumstance in which you look at an alternative professional football league and you see profit potential and large profit potential, and that would be a merger situation. So right from the start, that is probably the fastest way to any profitability. But short of that, you're absolutely right. On a day-to-day basis, on a year-to-year basis, you're probably going to lose a little money. But you become a big wheel in your hometown. You really elevate your status as a businessman by owning a professional sports team. That's always been the theory, and so you're absolutely right. Ego is part of the driver for sports ownership. Without ego, we'd probably be looking at a much smaller sports landscape.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's also interesting to sort of see how ego and practical business practices don't always converge neatly, especially when things sort of get out of hand or competition gets the better of people or other things, as we'll see in a few minutes. But so the league's announced. You've got a major league commissioner, as somebody with extensive television background. You've got money in the coffers ahead of time from television. Maybe you can kind of spin a few yarns on sort of the early crazy days of actually getting the thing up and running.
Sure. So it becomes a mad scramble to sign players. You're looking at the draft. You're looking at signability. The people with Michigan would talk about a signability factor they put on guys. Can we, is it worth drafting a guy number one, even if he's the best guy in the country, if we can't sign him? So, they're looking at all these things for the draft because the USFL had not only a common draft like the NFL does, but also a territorial draft where its teams would be able to grab players from local schools and essentially reserve their rights. So, for instance, you had guys from Florida and Florida State who would be assigned to the Tampa Bay Bandits to give them immediate local appeal, local draw, and Tampa would have first shot at signing these guys. Second of all, you're looking at NFL free agents. So anybody whose contract is coming up automatically has some negotiation power. If you're signing them at a premium of what they just played for. And so you're this mad scramble of signing players. And the guy who was out front leading that scramble was Hall of Fame coach George Allen, who was set up with the Chicago Blitz franchise. They were signing literally a couple hundred guys. They would go to prisons if they thought a guy had potential. They would sign a guy regardless of who held his rights in the USFL. They would just start signing and then work out the details later, either with some trade or with an apology or something. They just wanted to sign guys and get them into the league. And so this was happening right from the get-go. It was a very competitive situation. As you mentioned, ego was driving ownership. And so ego begins to drive signings. You do not want to be a laughing stock now that you've put your money into this venture. So very quickly there begins to build this pressure to build a team and to spend money doing it. And so you had people running out all over the place, and really kind of the USFL's hallmark moment early on was its draft and the number of people it was able to sign from there and how it really decimated that year's NFL draft before they could even hold it. The USFL draft was much earlier than the NFL, and they were able to sign guys and just decimate that NFL draft. And then, of course, after the draft, they landed the biggest player in all of America, which was Heisman Trophy winner Herschel Walker.
Well, so back up for a second. So I think it's really important to recognize that in the midst of the creation of this and the formation of this, and I got a couple of specific questions of that in a second, you also had perhaps manna from heaven in the NFL in its labor strife and what became and is now an ESPN 30 for 30 podcast, which I just listened to, a strike of players, right, with replacement players during the fall of 1982's NFL season, right? So in many respects, it almost is the NFL in many respects kind of shooting itself in the foot and opening the door to questioning the product of the NFL and fans, perhaps more open to the idea of a viable alternative in some way, shape, or form.
Right, and with the 1982 NFL strike, we didn't see, replacement players hit the field. That would have been, 5 years later when we saw the replacement players.
Correct. Thank you. Sorry.
Actually play for 3 years, but the 1982 strike was no less bitter. I mean, it was, a tough one. It wiped out almost half of the season. It was only a 9-game season and kind of made the playoffs a jumble, but it really soured a lot of players. Now, players, as soured as they were still going to act in their financial best interest. But it opened the door. I mean, the USFL certainly had a lot of fruitful discussions with players, with player agents, during and immediately after that strike in that season. There was a certain amount of momentum, and it soured the public a little bit. They had nearly half the season wiped out, and the NFL had a little bit of a tarnish on the shield at that point. So that turned out to also be, make it a good time to launch another league. Make 1983 a great time to launch another league.
Was there? Am I giving too much credit to the founders and the principals behind the USFL for anticipating that, or was that just a lucky connection of history?
I think that you had a situation where you had collective bargaining happenings going on, and as I mentioned, that the USFL did delay a year, and so I think part of that was all the background that was going on there. So certainly that strike did not come out of the clear blue. It was something that people knew was going to happen. It was certainly something that people behind the scenes realized that sides were really drawing lines in the sand, and so that was probably part of the impetus there, at least for a bit of a delay.
We in our episode number 11 with Philadelphia/Baltimore Stars longtime publicist Bob Moore, we talked quite a bit about the territorial draft and then general manager Carl Peterson's mastery of that. It does seem to me that was a very smart both player as well as marketing innovation on the USFL's part to recognize that local or regionally known talent, to the extent that they can be convinced to play in their regional USFL franchise, is a double word score win, right? Where you get the best of promotional capability as well as hopefully some quality players who are already known properties to potential fans and viewers.
And if you're a guy like a wide receiver coming out of Alabama, and you're being told you're probably a late-round NFL draft pick if you're lucky, you're going to have a hard time sticking through training camp, and the Birmingham USFL team grabs you, it becomes a very tempting proposition not to wait for the NFL draft and to sign right away and to continue to build your resume at the very least, and to be able to be paid well as a professional in your home area. And that was really part of the genius of that territorial draft, because that receiver from Alabama, if he goes off to play in Los Angeles, nobody cares. Nobody in the local market is going to care. If he plays in Birmingham, people are going to care, and they're going to recognize that name. So it really maximizes the value of that player. And, the territorial draft was an excellent way of making sure that local players were able to maximize their impact on the league and on their drawing power.
Well, speaking of territories, as we're sort of getting this first year underway in our little journey together on conversation, it's my understanding that there was also a very concerted effort to have a Canadian contingent of teams, a division or at least a few teams in this mix in the early days, but it seemed to kind of fall apart for a bunch of different reasons. And it looks like John Bassett, who ultimately became the owner of the Tampa Bay Bandits franchise with his pal Burt Reynolds, and a Canadian business mogul himself, Bassett, was unable to really sort of get that idea going. I'm wondering, how serious or close that might have been, having Canadian teams at the outset of the quote-unquote USFL.
I think that from the moment that the venture really got serious, that it was essentially an all-American league. Bassett himself had owned a team in the World Football League, the Memphis Southmen. And he ended up owning a team in Memphis because the Canadian government made all kinds of noise when he attempted to put a team in Toronto. He was going to have a team called the Toronto Northmen, and the Canadian government essentially blocked him, let him know that it wasn't welcome, that they didn't want the competition with the Canadian Football League. And so if any of that was looked at for the USFL, I think that it was shot down very, very quickly. Bassett, as you mentioned, has ties to Canada, but because of that Memphis experience, also had a history of operating a team in the U.S., and he had done so with other teams as well, other minor league teams. So, if there was anything like that really tossed about with the USFL, I think that it was either far in the future or it was in the very early planning stages, because this league was really a U.S. league from the moment that the plans really began to finalize.
All right, so we see the teams finally congealing. It seems like there was an attempt to get into San Diego, but that became Los Angeles. So maybe a little bit of a setup of some of the teams that began this process. We had teams in Washington, Tampa Bay, Philadelphia, Oakland, New Jersey, not / New York really, but New Jersey, Michigan, Los Angeles, the Denver Gold, Chicago Blitz, Boston, which is an interesting story and continues to be an interesting story for any pro sports team trying to start something in Boston, given, shall we say, relative lack of quality stadium opportunities. Arizona, and interestingly, and this is worthy of exploration in another episode, Birmingham, right? Sort of the what certainly becomes over time, as we see over and over again, when it comes to any idea about pro football and a new league, there's always Birmingham as the I want to call them the doormat, but certainly the forgotten professional city, I guess, that very much would love to step up to that next level, and here comes the USFL looking to fill that void.
Right, and I think it boils down to they have a stadium there. They're a southern outpost, and so it does fill a gap. And as long as you can find good, committed ownership, then it's a very tempting market. And they do have a history of some support. So it's not a market where you looked at any kind of disaster. Even the World Football League, the 1974 team, the Americans won the WFL championship and were well supported and played before a good crowd in that championship game and then folded. They had sheriff's officers confiscating their jerseys right after that game. There was no money left. And they immediately set up another Birmingham franchise for the 1975 season, the Vulcans, who drew well for the WFL's 1975 season. So it becomes a tempting market, that's for sure. And the USFL from the start wanted a mix of top markets. You needed the big markets. You needed the New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston for TV reasons, because otherwise TV networks aren't interested. But they also wanted to bring in some markets that did not have professional football, and that's where markets such as Birmingham come in, where Phoenix at the time comes in. Oakland, recently vacated by the Raiders. So they wanted a mix of those other markets as well.
So the signing of Herschel Walker with the New Jersey Generals, probably fair to say the most Comet-like event in the league's sort of fledgling history. It's interesting because no doubt there was money in the Dixon plan set aside for signing, I guess, what they called star or marquee players, right? Not too dissimilar to, say, what Major League Soccer does with their designated player thing that doesn't necessarily count against the cap and obviously is for the betterment of the league, right? And obviously there's probably at that time, no greater signing that you could find at that period of time in 1983 than Herschel Walker. But it's interesting because not only did he sign a contract, but it looked like he signed a contract with the league to some extent and almost had his own sort of decision process as to where he wanted to play. I don't think many USFL players had that luxury to kind of just decide where he might want to play.
And just looking at the league salary plan that you touched on, the original idea was to have $1.5 million salary cap per team. And you would be signing probably some mid-round draft picks. That idea kind of quickly evolved to $1.5 million salary cap per team, plus a couple of wild card exemptions per team. And that's exactly what you were talking about. The star players that you could bring on to boost the marquee value of the team. Now, what happened with Herschel's a junior. NFL would not touch them. They would not touch anybody whose senior class hadn't graduated. So he was hands off with the NFL. People have talked about that rule, and even now today that's been softened considerably, where you have underclassmen coming out all the time. But that wasn't an option at the time. So Herschel had actually looked into playing in the Canadian Football League. He was the most dominant player in America. Had suffered a couple of niggling injuries that made him a little bit concerned about his earning potential after college, and he wanted to turn pro. And he did. The USFL presented that opportunity. He would not have been able to do that without jumping to Canada if the USFL hadn't come around. So the USFL gave him that opportunity. He was slated for New Jersey from day one. The New Jersey owner did not want to sign underclassmen, didn't agree with it. It was an Oklahoma oil man named J. Walter Duncan, kind of old school. And so he was not, he originally did not want to sign any underclassmen. When this was presented to him, when he was told that Herschel's coming out one way or the other, Herschel already has essentially a quasi-agent already running around trying to work some deals. Whether the Dallas Cowboys ever admitted or not, they were working with the Cowboys. There was just no way Roselle was ever going to approve it. But Herschel was going to go to New Jersey. He was going to be the New York area superstar. And that's exactly what happened. You have this guy who's far and away college football's best, most well-known player, had just lifted a car off somewhere, helped somebody out of a burning car. He was a superstar already. And the USFL had this opportunity to sign him, and that's exactly what they did. And it really was this huge deal. It really undermined the NFL's case against underclassmen. It created all kinds of questions. People drew lines, but it got the attention of every news network. If anybody ever doubted that the USFL was serious, the damage that it did to that year's NFL draft and the signing of Herschel Walker showed that it was serious. It was not going to be a minor league.
Do you think Duncan's hesitancy in the beginning of signing an underclassman was informed or, around his, I don't know, it's kind of hard to sort of say this, but his desire maybe not to irritate the NFL too much, right? Given what we alluded to before is maybe certain owners thinking about the long term and what could ultimately be maybe a merger or some kind of relationship financially with the NFL down the road? Or is that giving him too much credit?
I think that, again, a very smart guy. I think that he did realize to an extent that they were poking the bear. But I don't think that was the main driver. I think that really that was the mindset of the people who were signing players at the time. Okay, whose senior class is graduating? Those are the eligible players. Because that's the way it had been. And, I also think you have an Oklahoma oil man who was probably, I'm guessing, just a little bit familiar with the University of Oklahoma and not wanting to upset anything there, wondering if they were opening up the floodgates. It wasn't just an isolated incident, but are you really opening up the floodgates for everybody? Everybody knew that rule against signing underclassmen is illegal. But who's going to litigate and spend 2 or 3 years litigating it? And that's the problem that they ran into for the players, is that, okay, we know this is bull, but we can't do anything about it. But, well, somebody did something about it by finding an alternative league that would sign him, and that was Herschel Walker.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get. And her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss. And of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum. And Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those two, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. So March 6th, 1983, the season starts, and almost from the get-go, a pretty much unabashed success, both at the gate over across the league. I mean, certainly some interesting hiccups along the way, and television ratings. I mean, maybe you can define a little bit about how 1983 kind of hit the marketplace. Do you think it met expectations, exceeded them? And I guess more importantly, or ultimately, what did the NFL think? And did the USFL folks care?
I think that on the outside, the USFL's 1983 season was a runaway success. They met their attendance projections. They projected about 25,000 in stadium attendance and hit that. They exceeded television projections, which was really the important piece. ABC, ESPN, this is new. This is football in the spring. They had some projections, and the USFL bettered them. Jim Spence, ABC's number 2 in command in their sports department, said that the league made them $12 million in '83 and $14 million in '84. So this was something that they were very well pleased with. It was, a runaway success from the outside. Now, on the inside, we had mentioned this salary cap idea that David Dixon started off with, and then that it had been supplemented with marquee players. Well, those had never really been budgeted for. That's not a zero-sum marketing game. These players cost something, and so in reality, that $1.5 million player budget was blown from day one because of the marquee players. So therefore, teams were losing more than they had projected, and this had a pretty drastic effect on some of the ownership. The Boston franchise, which was playing in an undersized stadium called Nickerson Field, had to leave town. There was just no way they were ever going to make it there. They could not come to an agreement with a decent-sized facility. They had to get out of town. The Chicago Blitz's owner, who was the heart surgeon from Arizona, he had lost tons of money. He wanted to get back to Phoenix. So he was done with the Chicago team, and he would take over ownership of the Phoenix team. Out west, the Los Angeles owners wanted to get out. The Denver owner, who had been very successful, who had actually made money even after startup cost that first year, he wanted to get out. The Arizona owner, he was ready to get out. So you had some of these guys who, after a season of losing $2, $4, $5 million, were ready to be done with it. But on the outside, things looked really good. And in fact, that helped some of those owners who were looking to get out, because you had people ready to come in and purchase these teams for the most part, which was a good thing. So the USFL, after year one, despite the kind of the storm clouds behind the scenes a little bit, they were actually in pretty decent shape, at least as far as being able to carry into year two. There was no real threat of them folding. The other thing that the USFL did was they expanded. And those expansion monies were used to kind of offset some of that initial loss. So that firmed up some of the ownership groups, took the sting out from the financial losses of the first season, and kept enough guys going forward, and they easily were able to sell 6 expansion teams.
Yeah, and so starting the journey in '83 with 12 teams and expanding the next year with 6 more. Yeah, and there were some moves, of course, of some of those first franchises. You mentioned Boston, which I think probably wins the award for the USFL's most peripatetic franchise because they spent 3 years in the league, each in different cities, New Orleans and then Portland, Oregon, of all places, in their journey. We can maybe talk about that, and obviously we'll go deeper into that one, hopefully with a super fan of the Breakers at some point if we can find one. But, look, we have the sort of the luxury of history, right, when we talk about this. But to your point, you're mentioning something that looks great on the outside and already is, frankly, exhibiting some behaviors on the inside that, in retrospect, would certainly, to the diligent manager, look as eyebrow-raising, right? But, expanding to 6 new teams, new franchises, in places that seem to be very similar to what you described before, a mix of major markets and, shall we say, underserved ones in Houston, Jacksonville, Florida, another sort of Birmingham-like market, at least until that point, before the Jaguars came into being in the NFL. Memphis, clearly, Oklahoma, Pittsburgh, and San Antonio, another sort of historically underserved or underappreciated market. Yet it seems that you have more than a fair share of the original 12 teams already changing ownership.
That's right. By mid-1984, half those teams did.
Right, with supposedly some very, very smart and intelligent businessmen. I mean, at what point does the outside world, sports journalists or fans or even other folks related to the industry, start to sort of figure out that maybe there's some issues perhaps with this, despite the all appearances of being very successful, certainly as a television product, and in many markets quite strongly attended and supported in the stands.
And though by all appearances, to somebody who is keeping an open mind and who is actually cognizant of the fact that the USFL was not the NFL, the 1983 season looked really good. To others, though, who were looking for the opportunity to criticize, and there certainly were a number of people, a number of sports writers who, for whatever reason, didn't like the league. They saw attendance of 25,000 as an absolute disaster. Hey, the NFL's drawn twice that. Yeah, the NFL is drawing twice that, but the USFL knew from day one that there's no way. They're playing in the spring. It's a new experiment. There's smaller markets. There's a lot of things working against you, and yet some made the comparison. The USFL's television ratings are a joke. Only the first year even compared to the NFL. Again, they're playing in the spring. This is a completely new product. ABC, the television, and ESPN, the television partners, never projected close to NFL numbers. The USFL exceeded those numbers, but that wasn't good enough for the critics. They weren't NFL numbers, therefore they were bad. So, while you had what to really an unbiased observer look like a very successful season, to those who were looking to find fault, they found plenty of it, and they went out of their way to make sure that people knew. So these ownership changes didn't go without notice. These people picked up on them, and they criticized again incessantly. And it was that was the surest sign that there were things going on behind the scenes, that the USFL ownership was shifting in that way. And some of that shift was natural. There were some bad geographic fits. Having an Oklahoma oil man run your New York-based franchise was never ideal. Selling off to a local was a much better proposition. Having a Phoenix-based heart surgeon, Dr. Ted Dietrich, own the Chicago franchise was never ideal, especially when you had a different USFL franchise in his hometown where he was running his practice. So there were some of those things that were kind of auto-correcting in the second year. But, yeah, it was a little bit of a sign that things may not be as rosy as an unbiased observer might think.
But also, right, you had the founder, Dave Dixon, who, by my research, had secured an expansion franchise for himself, or at least a franchise, in the beginning days of this, and I guess didn't seek to exercise that, and what ultimately became the Houston Gamblers franchise. But it ultimately was not his franchise at the end of the day, because even he had grown somewhat disenchanted, I guess, with the rapid expansion, I guess, of spending, perhaps unchecked by the owners. And if the founder of the whole damn thing in the first place bolts and sells his franchise before it even gets the opportunity to be exercised, that doesn't seem like a real strong ringing endorsement of the whole enterprise, does it?
And Dixon never had the cash to run a franchise anyway. So a little bit of that, and that's exactly what that's exactly what he told me, is that, he became concerned, but he never really had the cash to run the franchise anyway. So from day one, that was his fee for kind of creating the league, is that he got this automatic expansion franchise, which of course is only good if you have a good 1983 season, and the USFL did, in large part thanks to the foundations that he had set, but also an awful lot of hard work from an awful lot of people. So he really, from day one, was looking to sell this franchise, and that's what he did. He sold to a guy named Dr. Jerry Argovitz, who was a pretty well-known player agent and who established a team called the Houston Gamblers.
So I think it's really important to mention some of the new folks coming into the league brought with them some interesting baggage and background as well. We mentioned Ed DeBartolo earlier with Pittsburgh, and he sort of caused some eyebrow raising because his father, right, was at that point the owner of the San Francisco 49ers of the NFL. So that certainly added another.
His son was, and he's the father, and really it's the same money. Everybody knew it was the same money. It was the same organization. Just the son was the titular head of the San Francisco 49ers, and now the father was going to be the owner of a USFL team, the Pittsburgh Maulers. So that the NFL was up in arms about that, up in arms about potentially having a spy in their ownership group in Eddie DeBartolo Jr., who would go back and tell his father everything. And it really became a tense situation to where he was dismissed whenever they would discuss the USFL, where they forbade the move, and all to no avail. And one of these hallmarks of these pantheons of NFL ownership ended up buying a USFL team. What kind of message does that send about the viability of the USFL at that point when an NFL ownership group is buying in? So that was a big one.
So maybe this is a good opportunity to sort of ask, based on what you were able to reconstruct and maybe even remember when you were a fledgling fan of the Michigan Panthers franchise, what was the reaction of the NFL to this? Was it deep concern, or was it a little bit of sort of not necessarily fearing it too much as a competitor, given the fact that it was an off-season league and approach? I mean, maybe the dynamics between this powerful new thing that came off that on the radar screen in 1983 with the established NFL, were there concerns at corporate headquarters in the National Football League?
The NFL's reaction to the USFL changed so much from the time that the USFL announced its formation. The NFL, let's see what happens, to that 1983 draft when the USFL just wiped out the first round of the NFL draft, to signing Herschel Walker, the best college football player in America who would now not play in the NFL when he graduated from his senior class, or when his senior class graduated, to this moment where they felt like the USFL had swayed an NFL ownership group. So, the NFL was absolutely up in arms. At this point, it went from, and Steve describes it as looking at this, kind of pathetic little creature, they're here, to full-scale warfare in the course of a year. The NFL was armed and ready. They were developing plans to deal with the USFL. They were not ignoring the USFL by that point. Really, shortly after the USFL had been able to grab all those players in '83, the NFL knew that it had a real competitor on its hands. So the NFL did their best to block this move, to keep the DeBartolos out of the USFL. And the DeBartolos were adamant, and you were not going to bully Eddie DeBartolo Sr. He was not a guy who you were going to be able to do that with. If it was legal, he was gonna do it, and that he ended up purchasing a USFL team.
All right. Well, let's talk about the other major franchise shift in that summer of 1983, and it's obviously can't be understated the effect that one Donald Trump ultimately had on this league. But in August of '83, despite having signed Herschel Walker and giving it his best with the New Jersey Generals, J. Walter Duncan sells to the brash real estate mogul from New York, and arguably the turning point of the USFL itself in the process. Any understanding as to why and the motivations of, at least at that point, for Donald Trump to even be interested in what ultimately he would call small potatoes in the 30 for 30 documentary? Why, how, etc. about Donald Trump in this league?
Trump was a guy who was interested in the USFL before it launched. He was involved in some of the early meetings. He was targeted as their New York ownership. He ultimately decided not to invest at that time, and that's why Duncan, who had been looking at Chicago instead, was shifted over to New Jersey to own that team. So really, the USFL looked at it as an ideal situation. You had this young, energetic New Yorker, local New York ownership that was going to own their marquee team, the New Jersey Generals. The USFL looked at that as a boon. Trump, meanwhile, saw that there was potential here, potential for a bigger plan, potential because the USFL had pulled off its 1983 season. It had already kind of done, the hard startup stuff. So now you could take over a going concern, add to it, and execute your own plan. And of course, we know from looking back that his plan was to eventually force a merger with the NFL and to get his New Jersey Generals admitted as an NFL team that would move to Shea Stadium first in New York City and become the actual New York City team with both the Jets and the Giants playing in New Jersey.
Do you think, it's my understanding that he was interested prior to this as being an NFL owner as well, and maybe had been rebuffed by the sort of old boys club. Is that true? Do you think there was a rebuff in some way before he got involved with the USFL for him to actually get into the NFL?
If I remember correctly, I looked at the Colts and maybe the Patriots and had been rebuffed. And there's a lot of guys who get rebuffed. So, yeah, number one, young. So didn't necessarily fit in with the old guard of the NFL. But he wasn't that rich at the time. He wasn't nearly as rich as a guy like Al Taubman, for instance. He's still tied to his father. So there were probably a lot of things working against Trump. Guys kick the tires. It's too expensive for some. NFL knows it's too expensive for others who don't realize it. And so, he was rebuffed, yeah.
Well, that's interesting, too, because that's also another sort of sub-theme that's come up over the many months of our little show here. The AFL, right, probably doesn't exist without Lamar Hunt being rebuffed by his opportunity to try to get a franchise in the NFL. My love of the old New York Cosmos, right? You had the founder and the owner, of that basically being rebuffed, to get into the NFL club, and he decided that hey, maybe this soccer thing could be a way, for him to sort of make his mark in professional sports, and boy, did he on a worldwide scale for at least a couple of years. So it's interesting how that sort of not being invited to join the club dynamic can actually fuel passionately and maybe a little bit crazily competitive juices to either combat and then ultimately force some kind of financial benefit down the road.
And that underscores one of the reasons why these alternative leagues form, is that there's an artificial shortage of these teams. The leagues, such as the NFL, say, we're just not adding any teams. Even though there's demand, even though, we know that there are other markets who would like NFL teams, we're not expanding anymore. And they do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, they divide their TV contracts by the number of teams there are. So the more teams there are, the less each one gets as a percentage from the TV contracts. But also, it drives up franchise values because you have more demand than you have supply constantly. So even if you're losing money on operations, in the NFL teams haven't done that for a very long time. But even if you're losing money on operations, you're still increasing your asset value just because you control one of these precious NFL teams. You could, even if you're losing $7 million a year, if your franchise value increases by $10 million per year, you're holding on to that team as long as you can until you have to sell, even at losing $7 million a year, because at the end of the day, you're really increasing the asset value by a net of $3 million. So, yeah, it's one of the drivers of these leagues. One of the main business reasons is this artificial scarcity of professional teams that the leagues themselves impose.
Well, but Trump wasted no time, right? I mean, you had one season of the league under your belt, relatively, certainly externally successful. Some strengthening and some winnowing of some of the weaker deadwood, so to speak, ownership wise, right? But Trump's first owners meeting, right, in October of '83, he already broaches the idea, not so subtly, that the idea of the USFL moving to the fall may be the better ultimate move, where supposedly more fans and money reside, right? Because the NFL is there. But come on, that's, your first meeting. And then the second meeting later in the January of '84, right? He literally calls for a vote for a move to the fall. I mean, it may be one thing to actually have that as an idea, and you could make some arguments, I guess, economically, which he certainly did. I'm sure he was part of some of the consultant work, with Michael Porter from Harvard Business School and later the McKinsey report and all that, sort of making cases for things like antitrust and all that stuff, right? So even if antitrust, right, which is the first sort of introduction of that topic, is on the table and is legally a viable thing to fight, right? But the idea of, suggesting going after the NFL for anti-competitive reasons and potentially a fall season, might be a noble and potentially very smart idea, but to do that after barely 1 year of admitted okay success, I mean, it's hard for me looking back on that to see that dynamic as being healthy and even viable in the boardroom.
And, I should point out, one of the advantages that I had when writing this book is that it was written over a period of about 10 years. So almost all of my Trump stuff predates his run for the White House. So if you have presidential supporters or detractors, I stay out of those camps. I think you're right, though. I don't think that the word subtle is one that's usually used to describe Donald Trump, and certainly it wasn't when he came in. He had a certain plan. He absolutely did. He was not a guy who was going to come in and kind of see how things went and see what the best way was. He came in with a plan, and that plan was to force a merger with the NFL. He wanted his New Jersey Generals, of course, to be a part of that. I think people have made too much of maybe him leaving his partners behind. But the way that the ABA and WHA mergers worked out is that those who weren't merged in were paid off. So he definitely had a strategy in mind, and he came in full bore with it. And from really that first owners meeting on, every interview he would give, he pushed for the fall. His quote was, if God wanted football in the spring, he wouldn't have invented baseball, which is not really all that clever for a quote, but it was what he said, and probably a little bit damaging to the USFL's efforts. But he had a plan, and I think you really did it. You do the historical perspective a service the way that you stated it, that you can review the economics and kind of get where he's coming from. Now, the way he did it, maybe most of us want to pursue that course.
Well, so this is crucial, and obviously this is not going to be a detailed history like the book itself, however, is. And of course, we urge you listeners to run, not walk, to your favorite bookseller, whether it be online or otherwise, to get the United States Football League 1982 to 1986 from McFarland, written by our guest here, Paul Reeths, to get some of that depth. And obviously this is, as I said to you in our email correspondence by setting up this interview, I look at this as sort of as a foundational conversation in which we can go much more into various nooks and crannies and stories of teams and leagues and people and situations and stuff. But I think there's no doubt that any discussion of the league overall, and frankly, some of the teams specifically, do revolve around this issue. So there is that financial argument. I get that. And we can argue about the brusqueness or the relative lack of tact, shall we say, in trying to achieve that. But there is this other issue which is entwined but also separate in its own right, which is the idea of antitrust, right? Which ultimately wound up becoming a successful legal argument, albeit too late and not in time for to solve the financial problems and ills of the league. But maybe a couple of seconds on this theory of antitrust and the NFL, which again is yet another theme in our conversations, right? When challenger leagues sort of come up, and the unique protection that most of the, shall we say, major historical sports in this country have had protection from. And, you make the question, the argument, it keeps coming back again and again, the protection of such when restraint of trade, in other industries seems to somehow have special treatment when it comes to pro sports.
Yeah, and, the only sport that really can make a really great case for antitrust exemption is baseball. And even that, there's some question on if that was actually tested, whether it would hold up. It essentially holds up because there's been no counter ruling to it. So baseball's the one that has the actual antitrust exemption. And you had the NFL going around after the USFL folded saying that, without an antitrust exemption, there'll be no expansion. They were blatantly, publicly trying to strong-arm Congress into an antitrust exemption, or they were going to withhold further expansion teams. It shows you the emphasis that they placed on it after this USFL trial, because it exposed a weakness. And that weakness is the NFL was accused of predatory practices, of actively trying to stop the USFL from forming and succeeding, which is something the NFL always has done. The NFL did that to the American Football League. It went in and it stole the Minnesota Vikings ownership from the American Football League, forcing them to set up a team in Oakland at the last minute. The NFL threw a team into Atlanta to block the American Football League. The NFL threw a team into Dallas to block the American Football League. The NFL has always done this, and whether or not they're found guilty of it, it's what the intent of their actions is. Where the USFL was not able to prove antitrust grounds was pressure on the television networks, and that's where really the crux of the matter was, and they weren't able to prove that the NFL had pressured the TV networks to not televise the USFL in the fall, and that's why the antitrust arguments were successful in some degrees, but not in the area in which it really counted.
Well, so as we sort of kind of get sort of to the denouement here of the league, it feels to me that these issues of financial opportunities and maybe a larger market that could be shared with an NFL, economically, right, is one set of issues, and the other is the actual legalities of antitrust, et cetera. And again, hindsight is 2020. You wonder, with a admittedly successful first year under its belt and a 6 new franchises and growth and interest in a spring league that didn't exist before, that had created a new market and was, not completely unsuccessful in terms of creating a new product. Hell, one season, right? Let's put that in perspective, right? It's not 10 years, it's one.
Right.
You'd think that the idea of having a decent, protectable, and good growing thing in the spring without any competition of its own, while pursuing that legal argument, right, would be more the sort of sane approach and recognize more in a planned method, maybe over years, right? Trying to figure out, is there a way to directly compete but what if you're to win that legal argument, still playing in the spring? That could open up a lot of financial and economic benefits, right? Even if you were still a spring and summer league, with the added wind of legal opportunity behind your back with a change in the rules.
Sure. And there's two ways to win at this game. There is an antitrust judgment, but there is also putting the screws to the NFL so hard that the NFL knuckles under. The AFL, for instance, didn't have to sue to join the NFL. The NFL and the AFL sat down at the table after the AFL got its 1965 TV contract from NBC. The NFL knew it was not going away. It knew player costs were going to continue to rise exponentially. It knew it could not continue to compete with another league, and they sat down at the table and negotiated a merger. That's the other way you succeed. So by moving to the fall, by putting direct pressure on the NFL, you open up that other door. If you're playing in the spring, the NFL really, okay, let's see how this antitrust thing plays out. We're comfortable. We have very, very well-paid lawyers, probably better paid than yours. And so we'll take a shot at this. But if you can also apply that pressure, and, the NFL was much more vulnerable in that respect than it is today. You had ownership groups in New England and with the Sullivan family in Philadelphia that were probably a little vulnerable, that it wouldn't take, too much of an increase in player salaries before these guys start breaking out in a little bit of a sweat. So Trump was also looking at that. What he didn't fully take into account was that his fellow USFL owners were going to begin sweating far before these NFL ownership groups were. And because they were smaller in number, they were far more vulnerable to it, to the financial pressures that he was putting on by taking the league to the fall. There were some of them that were going to be able to ride that storm, but not enough of them. And so the other point is that while the perception we have here, again, is, this league, growing league, 18 teams now in 1984, it didn't take long for you to really start to see the cracks develop publicly. The new Chicago Blitz owner, a guy named Dr. James Hoffman, essentially abandoned the team before the season started. So you had no ownership group in the third largest market in the U.S. In the second largest market in Los Angeles, you had essentially a guy who had no money. A lot of things have been said about the guy, but he did not have J. William Oldenburg. He did not have the money that he was spending, and he would be out of the picture before the end of the year. So you had two of your top three markets that were dying, and the other one was owned by Donald Trump. So he was going to have a very large voice, because without those top three TV markets, you do not have a TV contract. And without a TV contract, again, you don't have a league.
So tactically, you think he was leveraging his outsized power, given sort of those cracks, and that probably just enabled him, right, to get to that sort of 2/3 majority and make that vote happen, right? But it doesn't seem that some of the other owners didn't go down without a fight, right? So Jeff Pearlman, a writer in sports and whatnot, apparently is working on a book himself about the USFL, and actually was high in praise last year after being initially worried about your book. He loves your book, and I think it's actually going to be a very helpful component to his writing going forward, and I think it's going to come out sometime later this year. Hope so. But he posted something, and this letter is out there on the web, and we'll certainly put it on our website as well. A stinging letter from John Bassett at the time, who was clearly started to suffer from significant health problems that ultimately took his life a few years later. But a quick quote, right? I mean, this gives you a really good example, right? It's obvious from, and this is quoting John Bassett in this letter to Donald Trump on August 16th, 1984. It is obvious from the record that you are a talented and successful young man. It is also a fact that I regard you as a friend and an owner who's made a contribution to the league in general, and been a savior to the New York, New Jersey franchise in particular. While others may be able, however, to let your insensitive and denigrating comments pass, I no longer will. You are bigger, younger, and stronger than I, which means I'll have no regrets whatsoever punching you right in the mouth the next time an instance occurs where you personally scorn me or anyone else who does not happen to salute and dance to your tune. And it goes on from there. It's clear that Bassett and others weren't necessarily enamored with Trump, despite some of the flagging ownership in other places. But, despite such verve from frankly influential owners like Bassett, how does the rest of the league, if you will, kowtow or bend backwards to kind of allow Trump-led forces to kind of, strong arm people into this move to into the fall, in your mind?
I think the short answer is that they were losing a lot more money than they projected and saw no way out. So you have Donald Trump, who has a plan. Whether you agree with that plan or not, he has a plan that has some historical and economic merit to it. Despite, a surly personality, and he pushes, pushed the first commissioner, Chet Simmons, around as much as possible. Bullies, he stuck his nose in where it didn't belong, tried to directly insert himself into television negotiations when he did not have any league approval to do so. In fact, had been told by the league not to do so. He did whatever he could. He just continues to push and push and push. A guy like Bassett, who bought fully into the USFL plan, who was operating in an NFL market and succeeding. The Tampa Bay Bandits were this incredibly well-marketed machine that was succeeding in an NFL market, and the Buccaneers needed no help at that time to look bad. They did that all by themselves. But the Bandits made them look even worse because they were a fun team. They were exciting. They were well-marketed. And Bassett ran just such an ideal program. He saw this possibility. He captured this lightning in a bottle, and he saw the possibilities of the USFL. Now, whether every team in the USFL, or even most of them, could do that, that's open for some debate. But he was no fan of moving to the fall. And, in truth, I think he's one of these good guys. He's a guy who you just can't paint him in a bad light in relation to the USFL because he bought completely into the concept. He was a big supporter. He was there to, I think he saw part of his role as assisting the commissioner. And, they saw the commissioner being bullied by Trump. And so he inserted himself into that conversation. Unfortunately, he did become sick, as you mentioned. He had developed a couple of brain tumors, and that cancer eventually took his life. So he was not around to continue to fight it. And, he was pretty weak, I think, when the vote for the fall was taken.
Yeah, and that 1985 season, obviously playing out still, with television and all that stuff. But it's clear that, and John Bassett was on national TV in an interview talking about what maybe now an open secret, where you had differing opinions in the USFL and arguably devolving into charges of, and maybe even accurately so, mismanagement. I think it's also important to recognize that by this third season, you had, as you were saying, teams that were sort of floundering, but also merging to kind of sort of succeed and stick around, right? You had teams, kind of putting pieces together to kind of keep propping it up. So it seems to me, though, that then, because of the dynamics already in play, that in essence, whatever could have been an economically viable plan by itself, divorced from the legal challenges, became inseparable from those legal challenges, almost to the point where the whole future of the whole damn thing relied upon a successful verdict in this antitrust case that finally came about and was heard in the summer of 1986. Correct? And
you look at the quandary that the USFL was in by that point, where you were missing ownership in Chicago and Los Angeles, and those franchises had really they really looked bad because they hadn't been able to draw anybody. They hadn't stuck any money into marketing. Los Angeles had done everything in its power, despite the fact that the ownership really shouldn't have been there. to draw fans. Steve Young, they get who was going to be the number one draft pick in the NFL. They bring him in, and it results in a dull thud. I believe they said that the number of season tickets that they sold after the Young signing was about 100. So, whereas Herschel Walker brings in 10,000 when he signs. So you had this Los Angeles that was just completely indifferent, the second largest market, no ownership for Chicago. They had struck out twice and couldn't find a third owner who wanted to play in the spring. So you had these cracks that were also developing. And you're right, at that point, you have other ownership looking at this, looking at their own red ink, looking at how much money more money they had lost than they had projected. And seeing that, right now there is no way we will make this back. ABC and ESPN, which by that point had combined, came back with a significantly increased television offer, which would still not have been nearly enough to offset losses. And that was the best deal that they could get. They couldn't get interest from any of the other major networks. Fox was still not there. So they went with their next best option, which was to try to force the NFL's hand, to put the pressure on the NFL for a merger and to sue, hoping that one of those two eventualities would create a merger.
So I think it's also interesting too. So that case was heard in May of '86, and the jury came back in July of '86 in a second. And we're rounding the end of our discussion here, but I do want to talk about the actual state of the product, right? And in the spring of 1986, because it was envisioned. I guess there was debate of whether to play a spring season before moving into the fall. But you'd already seen a reduction in teams from 14 in 1985 to about 8, and there was some more merging and folding and all that kind of stuff. But I wonder if and obviously a 1986 season in the spring never happened, but I wonder the inability for the league to, either put a spring product out or have a cohesive discussion about, to the public as to why they needed to wait until they got their act together for the fall. It would almost seem like, in some respects, at least public relations-wise, was kind of shooting itself in the foot by not somehow continuing to play, or at least give off the appearance that franchises were stable, in place, and preparing to do so. I wonder if that had any effect in, people's backbone around this idea that this case was actually going to be not only worth pursuing, but ultimately successful, albeit in a Pyrrhic way.
Right. And, I think that by the end of that 1985 season, you had a lot more ownership groups that were in trouble. You had Denver, which was formerly a league stalwart, which was you saw attendance tumble, and they were on their way out of town. You saw the Oakland was taken over by Al Taubman from Michigan, and basically doing them a favor almost, just to keep his foot in the waters. You had the Houston Gamblers ownership that was failing. The Phoenix ownership after 1984 had failed and had to bring in the Oklahoma ownership to take it over. Portland was done. San Antonio was done. There was no owner yet in Los Angeles. Jacksonville needed some help. They were trying to sell some stock, and in fact then eventually brought in the Denver owner. Tampa Bay, with the passing of John Bass, had brought in somebody new. Lots of questions on if he could even pay for things. Birmingham, their owner was gone. They had brought in a new guy. Again, questions on could he do this? You saw a further whittling of ownership. And so spring or fall, by the end of that 1985 season, the USFL was hemorrhaging cash with no real possibility of seeing any of it back in the near future, and just more red ink on the way.
It sounds like that sent mixed signals to the public, right? Because the plan was to play in the fall of '86, regardless, right? And the case was still dragging out and was not, even close to being decided until the summer, right? I guess my question to you would be, based on your knowledge and your interviews and your conversations, how realistic was that fall 1986 season in the first place until they announced in August of '86, August 1st? And this was after, I guess, the court case had been initially decided, that they were not officially going to play in the fall of '86.
The 1986 season, whether the owners knew it or not, was always contingent upon a successful jury verdict, because Donald Trump was not going to play in 1986 unless they won that trial. And without a New York franchise, they had no LA, they had no Chicago. Without New York, they don't have an ESPN contract, which was their only television contract going into that season. In addition, Baltimore had been bought by a guy named Stephen Ross, who now owns the Miami Dolphins, and he also, I believe, had no intention of playing unless there was a successful jury verdict. So I just don't see a way that the USFL would have gone on one more year. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that part of the reason for so much red ink was the spending that was in part accelerated by Donald Trump. He came in when he bought the New Jersey Generals. He signed all kinds of NFL guys, greatly increased the payroll of the New Jersey Generals, but also increased the pressure on his fellow owners to sign those kinds of players. So, part of the reason for barrels of red ink at that point was, that Donald Trump had helped to accelerate player signings. I think sometimes his role in doing so is a little bit overstated, because that process had already begun the year before he ever signed on. When the Michigan Panthers basically raided the Pittsburgh Steelers offensive line on their way to a championship, when George Allen was out there signing everybody, when the Generals signed Herschel Walker, when you had the wild card exemptions, that process was already underway, but Trump accelerated it. And so by the end of the 1986 season, you had simply not enough guys who were able to go on. And the jury verdict then, when it did not produce a sizable financial award, was the nail in the coffin.
All right, so two things there quickly. One, in retrospect, or maybe I don't know if this is true or not, was there... So I know, like, at the end of the 85 championship game, and we'll probably have a clip to that on our website when we post this episode in the next week or so, there was allusion to, hey, you guys have now an 18-month break, right? Because it was already announced that they were going to move to the fall. Was there any serious consideration of having a spring season in 86 and then potentially doing 86 in the fall as well, or was that idea never really realistic, right? I mean, at least to keep some kind of momentum going without that gap.
Yeah, I don't think that there was any real discussion about that, just because of the nature of football, that it would have been hard to essentially stage two seasons in one calendar year. What the USFL did to really show the public that they were continuing operations was each team signed a core of players that they still had. I know that there were a few mini camps that were held in 1986, that late summer and early fall late summer it would have been. Jim Kelly appears on the cover of Sports Illustrated in a New Jersey Generals uniform from one of those mini camps. The Outlaws did too, I believe the Renegades. So there were a few things, but everybody was just waiting for that jury verdict to come in, because that was what the entire season was hinging on.
All right, and let's cap this then with that jury verdict. So for those who are, you young whippersnappers out there who were not around and or don't sort of know the story, you want to sort of tell our audience sort of how the USFL won the case but lost the battle, so to speak?
Sure. The USFL sued the NFL on antitrust grounds, saying that it had purposefully monopolized professional football, used predatory tactics against the USFL, and in particular, the most vital claim was that the NFL had put pressure on the television networks to not televise the USFL in the fall and to suppress television income in general. The USFL hired a guy named Harvey Meyerson to make this case, and by most accounts, he was in over his head. And he resorted to theatrics when, he may have been able to build an economic case for the jury, but most people felt that the jury was kind of lost by the theatrics and that he alienated himself a little bit by a very cool NFL attorney named Frank Rothman, who was able to paint Meyerson and some of the witnesses, including Howard Cosell, in a bad light. So at the end of the day, instead of being awarded what would have amounted to over $1 billion in damages, because antitrust cases automatically carry treble damages, they triple whatever the award is. Instead of being awarded over $1.2 billion in damages, the jury came back finding the NFL guilty of creating a monopoly, but awarded the USFL just $1. And there was different accounts from the jurors. Some were obviously confused by the number of instructions, by the number of things they had to look at, by the economic arguments. They thought that the verdict could be adjusted. Others claimed that there was no confusion. It was a very divided jury. It sounded like a very tough time where people were fainting and screaming at each other. And at the end of the day, the USFL was awarded $1, which was eventually tripled with interest. And that $3 and I believe 76-cent check is what the NFL eventually ended up mailing in for its part, in addition to several $1 million in attorney fees for the USFL as the prevailing party.
So I guess what I don't understand, and clearly this will be fodder for another conversation, perhaps with a legal expert and maybe somebody perhaps in the courtroom or in that process during that time. But, what I'm trying to figure out, and I still don't know, and I need to go deeper into why the variability between such a large amount of money expected having won the case and it basically being essentially vacated, at least financially. Where does the discretion for adjusting the amount of damages awarded come from? I mean, is that the court? Is that the judge? Is that the jury? It seems confusing to an outsider like me as to why you would win on the merits of the case, but you would not get recompensed in any substantial way. Right, it almost seems like,
and it was
yeah, you're right, but sorry, you're not.
Right, yeah, it was the jury in both cases. The jury made the guilty verdict, and they also came up with the damage award. Some of the jurors thought that the judge would adjust it, and that is not the case. So yeah, there was some confusion there. When I look back on this judgment, I have a hard time not looking at it as the jury blaming the victim. Okay, the NFL is guilty of monopolization, but you also did all this stuff to do this. Okay, well, is the USFL on trial here, or is it the NFL? Because you just said that the NFL was guilty, but your whole judgment is based on the but. Yes, the USFL did things wrong. Former Arizona and Oklahoma Outlaws owner Billy Tatham says, people are looking at us running around this burning house like madmen, but they're just ignoring the fact that the NFL's tossing the matches in. Yeah, we made mistakes, but the NFL's setting the fire. So I do have a hard time to this day with that jury verdict. That if you're going to find that the NFL didn't monopolize professional football and the USFL is awarded to nothing, that's one thing. If you're going to find that the NFL did monopolize and broke the antitrust laws, then you need to award something that's at least a slap on the wrist, and $1 is not.
And oddly, the appeal, right, was not about the verdict itself, but the amount of money that should have been awarded, supposedly, and even that appeal was upheld.
Yeah, and even the appeal goes through the litany of mistakes that the USFL made. It's just the USFL itself is on trial and was the whole time. And the NFL and From the start, the judge did not allow testimony about the NFL's other antitrust cases. It did not allow evidence about the NFL's other anti-competitive motions, such as all that it did to undermine the AFL. It didn't allow some of the stadium discussions where the NFL actively tried to keep the USFL out of NFL stadiums when the USFL was launching. There was clear evidence of that. So it seemed like kind of to me, a stacked deck against the USFL, where rather than the NFL being at trial, it was as if the USFL was supposed to have behaved absolutely perfectly, or the NFL was kind of guiltless no matter what they did.
Yeah, it almost feels like that. The denigration of the award almost feels like it was a signal that really, what are the damages, right? How much have how much injury has really taken place? Yeah, you're right on the merits, but you guys are all sort of rich and trying to create an enterprise for yourself. Did you really suffer too much in damage that you didn't self-inflict?
And when they bring a guy like Donald Trump up to the stand, you can see a jury looking at him and saying, boy, you just don't really look like a guy who's really hurting all that bad. And, it was Trump's handpicked guy, Meyerson, who led this trial. And I think that there are a lot of guys that they could have brought up there who had lost their shirts, who would have presented much better to the jury.
As having been financially injured and could have, right. That's right. That seems like it'd be a more palatable strategy in front of a jury.
Right. Instead of here's our New York owner who, boy, he really looks like he's going to do okay. This guy's got money to survive this thing, rather than, the ownership in Arizona who had, suffered real loss, or some of these other guys who were on their last penny. That was a tremendous mistake, I think. Now whether or not that would have swayed the jury, that's really all conjecture. I don't think that it was good strategy. And I also don't think that the USFL presented the economic arguments all that well, that Meyerson went into all these weird projections rather than just sticking with what we lost and how it was done. And, I think that he did a tremendous injustice to the USFL's case, yet somehow got a guilty verdict, yet somehow only got $1.
Yeah, I'd love to do a separate episode at some point. Maybe you've got some pointers as to who about sort of the the specific legal drama in both of those cases and the twists and turns and maybe the mistakes made in that process. Because I think that one, it hasn't really been sort of deeply dived into, and two, you can sort of play a little bit of what if history here, right? So what if things had changed? What if substantial damages were awarded and trebled? What if there was a competitive league in the fall? So let me lead to two last quick questions, and I appreciate your time, and I'm sure our audience has more than appreciated this walk down the tortuous road of the USFL, and perhaps hopefully more to come in our conversations. But number one is, at the end of all of this. So the case has been made, and the legal machinery agrees that there was anti-competitive. Why has nobody else taken advantage of that since? Right, and the NFL is arguably more popular than ever, but maybe some chinks in the armor starting to show. We can debate that separately, but you think that the USFL didn't sort of, it's clear that the league has been wounded at this point, right? Not to some,
right.
financial extent. It would seem to me that there would be another opportunity or opportunities to kind of take advantage of this decision and maybe either make a true full go at it, either competitively in a fall kind of way, or frankly, start up another spring league, right? Where, to the USFL's credit, they created and tapped into an appetite for the sport in the quote unquote off season.
Sure. And let me make the argument that maybe no matter what the USFL did, it was doomed from the start. Because by the early 80s, about half the NFL's total revenue was coming from television. the other half coming from everything else. So USFL in-stadium attendance projected at about half of what the NFL was doing. So at best, on that side of the ledger, on half of your revenue, you're doing half of what the NFL does. On the television side, the NFL is earning 15 times as much as you are. There is no way you are competing with the NFL for any length of time. What the USFL did for 3 seasons was almost miraculous in being able to hold out that long. Because the economics, the base economics on a revenue basis was so far against them that they shouldn't have been able to make the impact that they did. The NFL was able to outspend the USFL by wide margins at every turn, and yet the USFL was like these guerrilla warriors that got in for this 3-season period and shook things up, and really to the betterment of players. But when you look at its long-term possibilities, that television revenue was going to be really this kind of damning piece against them. They weren't going to be able to overcome. The NFL had so much more revenue potential with television than the USFL did.
All right, and the capstone question, of course, is what do you think the legacy is of all this? And do you think there is a time when the NFL, given its superior legacy economics and bulwark status and leverage in the football industry in this country, do you think that there is another challenger league or some other evolution that either takes advantage of the legally questionable antitrust state that the NFL operates in?
I think if you go into it looking at antitrust as your strategy to succeed, you're in real trouble. What you need to start off with is a viable business plan, and then antitrust issues to raise them. But the viable business plan is where there's the problem. Again, the economics, as bad as they were in the 1980s against any challenger league, are even worse now. The NFL is earning an unsightly amount from television to where there's no way for a competitive league to get that. If there's a league that's vulnerable, it's probably the NHL, a major league that's vulnerable, but even then it's just tough. You're scaling against so many factors, including the fact that the current leagues all have the best facilities, all have history, all have fan bases, all have the best players. They have a significant first mover advantages, but they also have all the best TV contracts. And that's what's propping them all up. So unless the television networks all at once get tired of somebody and say, yeah, we're going to give the money to a challenger, I don't see what the viable business plan would be. The television money has just made the wall so much higher, which is why we have not seen any challenging leagues emerge in the last 35 years. Leagues that competed with the established major leagues for players. The XFL did not do that. The UFL did not do that. We've seen nothing in any of the other sports. And before that, you had a period of the ABA and the WHA and the AFL and the WFL, and it finished off. That era was really finished off by the United States Football League.
Yeah, it's interesting, too. You think that that spring and football could absolutely still go together in some professional manner, right? Given lots of television economics that's sort of out there, and cable is flourishing and nourishing, but no doubt directly competitive, certainly not. And those other economic issues that dominate pro sports generally, but you still wonder, there's an appetite, right? The one thing that the USFL also did, right, was prove that there was an appetite for football, And we talked a bit about this with our previous guest, Jim Foster, the founder of the Arena Football League, right? Where, they were never going to play against the NFL on a schedule-wise, right? And they were also a completely differentiated and different product.
Right.
It still feels to me, even to this day, that, some logical and not too crazy professional approach to some type of spring-type football, maybe now not as easily done now given the growth of soccer and the resurgence of baseball. But, it seems to me that there's always an appetite for football in this country, and it seems to always will be. You wonder why a spring product of some stability and significance would not be attempted again. And maybe you're arguing why economically it's just even in the quote unquote off season of the NFL, it's just too hard to mount a challenge.
Well, and your best case scenario would be to get a couple of corporate giants together and form a league that already had television inroads in the spring and see what happened. And that's what happened, with Vince McMahon and NBC. Is they did exactly that. Now, some of the theatrics I can understand turn people off, but they did a reasonably good job of drawing attention, especially initially. They did a reasonably good job of getting people into the stadiums, and they still lost a ton of money. And NBC backed out. They no longer saw any television potential, and they backed out, causing the whole thing to collapse. Now, we've recently, in the last few weeks, heard that Mr. McMahon might be exploring this possibility again. So maybe he has some other ideas. Certainly the entire television industry is so much more splintered than it was in the 80s. The NFL has been, up to this point, one of these rare properties that has been able to maintain, some real ratings, some really great ratings. And now, especially over the last two seasons, we've seen maybe a little bit of that erosion. Maybe it's just catching up with the NFL. Maybe it's some of these other peripheral issues, too, that are affecting. But it's going to, I think, take some kind of change on that side of the equation, on the television revenue side of the equation, before anybody would have a shot. In professional football is just ridiculously expensive to run. Even on a kind of a minor league basis, on an XFL, NFL Europe type of salary basis, or even less, it's still very expensive to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting, too. I think sort of the NFL has some existential challenges ahead of it as well. Stadium and locales and how those stadiums get funded. Certainly the growing problem of CTE and the relative health and long-term physical stability of players, both current and former. And how it's propping up the broadcast television industry, which itself is going through fits and changes. I don't know. It's very interesting. I would keep an eye indeed on Vince McMahon. I can't imagine he's the only other one sort of seeing relative weak links in the previously invincible National Football League. Stay tuned, I would say, right? I think football is going to go through some interesting changes and perhaps maybe even in a, I don't know if we'll ever go back to the wild and woolly days of the USFL or the WFL and those sort of challenger leagues from the heyday of the 70s and early 80s, but it's certainly a space to be. All right, so let's end this with some promotional stuff. So tell us, again, remind us the name of the book, what you're doing to promote it, other things going on that you'd like to call attention to, just general promotional time. Here's your chance.
The book is called The United States Football League, 1982 to 1986. And the easiest way to order it is right on Amazon. You can also go to McFarland.com. Both have it for the same price. Amazon, it's Prime, so you can get it within 2 days. I really hope that those who remember the league, remember it fondly, look at it as a little bit of a definitive history. It is chock full of interviews. I was able to talk with David Dixon, several owners. Steve Earhart was a tremendous help. Chet Simmons, the first commissioner, coaches, players. So I wanted to give them all a voice. Lots of never-before-heard stories in the book. If you were at all interested in the USFL, if you were at all interested in pro football, particularly in the 1980s, but also just the economics. I think it shows the USFL as a business entity, but also as kind of looks at what happened on the field. So, however you remember the USFL, I think that it has some stuff in there for you. It was a lot of fun to write. So I'd love for you to purchase it and give me some feedback. The other thing that I'm working on right now is a statistical site called statscrew.com, STATS, crew.com. And that has statistics for all these alternative leagues, including the USFL, the WFL, XFL, NFL Europe, in addition to the NFL, the CFL, and really branching through all sports. We have historic indoor soccer, we have today's MLS, we have the NBA and ABA, WHA, NHL, and just a ton of others. So it's meant to be a one-stop shopping for not only the statistics of these teams, but using those statistics to tell the teams' stories. And really, I think when you get to some of these alternative leagues like the USFL, some of those stories are among sports' most interesting.
Well, I appreciate, so you've set me up perfectly, right? So that's exactly why we do this show, although I wonder sometimes why I do it. It's exactly that. One, tapping into other people's remembrances and passions, such as yours in this conversation, for which we thank you. But then secondly is also, going back into some of those things and opening up those old boxes that were long ago put in the corner and gathering dust that indeed have a wealth of interesting stories, twists and turns. I mean, and you have to look no further than our current president, right? Regardless of how much you agree or disagree with his whatever he's trying to do with the president, right? Is it brings the USFL back and look, those who ignore history are only doomed to repeat it, right? And whoever said that don't know, but all you can see the USFL and Donald Trump as a microcosm, perhaps, of what's going on today. And, these are stories that continue to have life, renewed life, and the patterns that we've seen so far and we will see still further do indeed repeat themselves. And there's some amazing and interesting stories that come out of all this. And we appreciate you doing what you've done for the USFL book. The stats site indeed is also very compelling, and I look forward to hopefully staying in touch and stumbling across some other areas, either of USFL or other stuff in the world of forgotten sports teams and leagues to discuss with our audience.
I really appreciate you doing this show. These kind of forgotten teams and leagues have always been a passion. The USFL, of course, is kind of my number one, but when USA Today would come out in the 80s, I'd be the guy who's looking through the agate and trying to find, what is this major league, whatever, what is this National Lacrosse League or Major Indoor Lacrosse, and what are all these minor league baseball outfits and the indoor soccer and, all these leagues that, are outside the Big Four but providing entertainment. And I think especially today, it's so easy to get caught up in the cult of personality that is sports and forget that it's kind of about the entertainment, and that whether that entertainment occurs on an AstroTurf soccer field or in an alternative professional football league, it's still entertainment and it's memory building. And there's a part of what sports should be in these leagues where it's not all do or die. It's fun. You go out and root for your team. They become a part of you and a part of your memories. But at its core, it's entertaining. And that's what I love about these teams and these leagues.
All right, interesting stuff. As always, I always learn something and more than a few things in this conversation with Paul Reeths. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul. And let's see, the book that we talk about that you should buy, you should own, and you should devour, as I have, written by Paul Reeths, is called The United States Football League, 1982 to 1986. It is published by our friends at McFarland. You will find a link to that book, also in Kindle form as well. If you don't want to fork up the big bucks for the paperback edition, you will find a link to all of that stuff on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search for the episode number 46, and you will find a link to that. You will also find a link to another book that we referred to during our conversation that was written by the late Jim Byrne, he the former director of communications for the USFL. That book is out of print, but it is available. It's called The $1 League, The Rise and Fall of the USFL, of course, by Jim Byrne. You will find a link to that on our website. In addition, we'll also put a link to the documentary that, if you haven't seen that, that'll also sort of help frame our current and future USFL conversations. That was the Mike Tollins directed film for ESPN 30 for 30. I think it was from the first season, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong there, but it's called Small Potatoes, Who Killed the USFL. And yes, spoiler alert, you will see an appearance by Mr. Trump in his pre-presidential days. And you can judge for yourself as to what kind of role he played in the ultimate demise of the United States Football League. All good stuff. Again, goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where you'll find all the old episodes. And by the way, while you're there, make sure that you go back and download and listen to our episode number 11, if you haven't already. That was our real first foray into the USFL with longtime Philadelphia/Baltimore Stars USFL publicist Bob Moore, with some really crazy stories about the life and times of the Stars franchise, arguably the most successful and stable franchise, despite them being in two cities, in the league's short 3-year history. So all that stuff, you can't say that we're not thinking about the USFL, and it's all there for you, and plenty more to come in future episodes. So please keep, as they say, your cards and letters coming. We'd love to hear them. Let's see. We want to thank our friends at Podfly. Thank you, Podfly Productions, Eric Begay and Corey Coates and David Gregerson, and of course, the inimitable Jerry Payne, who puts up with my nonsense every single week with all the various recordings and stuff, and he makes it come out sounding smooth, sounding nice. And I guarantee you it is not nearly as nice when it goes in, but when it comes out, it is absolutely fine. And we appreciate Jerry Payne and the friends there at Podfly Productions. If you want the same treatment, if not better, by all means, go to podfly.net. Tell them that Tim Hanlon and or Good Seats Still Available sent you, and they will be more than happy to help you with your podcasting needs, whether they be novice, beginner, or advanced. Tremendous folks down at Podfly Productions. Last thing, please follow us on social media. We love your tweets and your comments. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You'll find a Facebook page devoted to us as well. Give us a like or some love there. And of course, if you want to send us some email and all that stuff, just go to our website. Again, goodseatsstillavailable.com. All right, that's enough for me, don't you think? Sure. All right, we'll see you next week. More fun and frivolity to come. Take care, everybody. Thanks for listening.